And just a brief welcome to everyone to our educational event on mining and health, digging for the truth. Our facilitators today are Claudette Kelly, who is a very activist and nurse leader who is stationed in BC and is very knowledgeable about this topic and actually raised this topic with us and got us all motivated to address it. As well, Shelly Archibald is our communications officer, and myself, June Kaminski, who just stepped into the president role. So I'm going to turn off my microphone and hand it over to Claudette, who will start.
Thank you, June. I'll just go ahead and do my blurb, and I'll work through the first 10 slides or so as I do that. If something goes wrong, just raise your flag and then I can get June to intervene and we can go from there. So I thought I would start by just briefly introducing you to the history of the AJAX project as I have come to know it over the last 4 years in Kamloops. For those of you who have never been to Kamloops, this is going to be a bit of a travel log as well, because it's hard to speak about this mine without getting into some of the geography and some of the climate involved, because those are significant in terms of health impact. So historically then, sometime in 2011, I became aware that there was a mine being planned. These were early days, I believe, in the development of ideas around the development of this mine. And initially, when I first heard about it, I had just been traveling abroad, and when I got home, my daughter said to me, "Mom, you won't believe what's happening. There's a plan for a huge open pit gold copper mine within the city." And I of course did a double take and couldn't believe what she just said. And when I started to inquire, there was already by then a community citizens group that had formed. It was called the CAPA, the Kamloops Area Preservation Association, and it was made up of a group of concerned citizens, including a few retired physicians and a fellow by the name of Michael Hewitt, who was had a government background and knew a lot about mining and a nursing background too, incidentally. And Michael was instrumental in representing sort of the health concerns on CAPA in 2011. And Michael decided to move to Eastern Canada in the summer of 2011. And I was asked, summer of 2012, and I was asked to replace him on what had become then a community advisory group. Government, both levels of government, federal and provincial, had instituted something they said was new and revolutionary in Canada. And that was that part of the assessment process would include a citizens group. And we've become known as the Community Advisory Group. So I was asked to step up and replace Michael on that group as a representative from CAPA, from the association that was originally formed with concerns about the mine. So as you can see from the slide here, this has actually been going on for more than 3 years now. It's well over actually 4 years. And there are some 87, well, actually probably closer to 100,000 people involved in our area, because Kamloops serves quite a large area from Merritt to the west, to Salmon Arm to the east, Vernon to the south, and Williams Lake to the north. So we cover quite a large central Caribou, upper Shuswap, sort of the upper arm of the fruit growing belt in the Okanagan. Now, for those of you who've never traveled through Kamloops, we are at the confluence of the North and South Thompson rivers in a very dry, dusty, semi-arid valley, very much like Arizona. When I look out my window right now, it reminds me a little bit of the dry south in the United States. So the long and short of it is the mine proceeded to put together an application which has to be submitted to the Environmental Assessment Office and its federal counterpart. Up until recently, federal governments were instrumental in reviewing mining applications. However, this latest administration, in its wisdom, has decided that all of those applications will now be vetted in a joint application process involving the Minister of Mines at the federal level and the Minister of the Environment in British Columbia and the Minister of Mines in British Columbia. So those are the three key people who make the decision at the end of the day on whether an application is sufficiently complete and addresses all of the concerns put forward throughout the application process. So the initial plan then, I neglected to mention, government also put in place a second group, and it's known as the Technical Working Group. So you can see from this slide, there's actually three constituencies that advise the ministries on these mining projects. So there's community advisory group made up of a broad representation of, so I guess on that committee there'd be about 25 people representing fish and game, grasslands, the Astronomical Society, so a broad range of folks. And the technical working group would involve mining engineers. I'm trying to think of, we've never actually met with that group. All I have is a long list of names. And many of them, most of them, I would say on the technical working group, do not reside in Kamloops. They're from Ottawa or Victoria. They're from various ministries, and they have some kind of technical expertise that has to do with mining. And First Nations communities, there are actually a number of First Nations communities involved here as well. So they've been consulted as well by government, but we haven't had any contact with them. Initially, we were told that the three groups would be given opportunity to meet at some stage. However, that's never happened. So we've worked completely in isolation. And I have to say that the work, at least on the community advisory group, has been very sporadic. I think we've met 4 or 5 times over the last 4 years. So you can see that it's not been a well-planned, well-orchestrated kind of work group. So the initial plan then, AJAX's initial plan was for quite a large project. The area covers some 25 square kilometers, and it's the mine site sits directly above the city, and prevailing winds would sweep over the mine, and whatever air quality events would happen, it would be carried throughout the river valleys. And so that's one of the main concerns, is the location of the mine. So the size and the location of the mine are the two main concerns of many of these groups in town that I will mention here in a few minutes. So initially the plan was for a dry tailings stack placed adjacent to the Coquihalla Highway. And one of the problems was the height of the stack was approximately the height of the Seattle Space Needle. And so there were, of course, many concerns associated with that, not the least of which was the potential for climate change. And some of the technical experts actually said that should that tailings stack be built adjacent to the Coquihalla Highway, it would actually increase, it had the potential to increase road accidents for people traveling the Coquihalla as they entered our city. So the first public comment period was held in the spring of 2013, and there were hundreds of submissions posted on the Environmental Assessment Office website. I was, as a member of the community advisory group, I was provided with a copy of those comments, and I had a stack of some 800 pages recording those comments. So there was a broad representation within that. And then the slide you're looking at now informs us about the environmental assessment process, and you'll see that the first 4 slides shown in blue and that first dotted line, we're just on the left-hand side of that left dotted line at this point in time. So when we enter that purple phase, we're going to be actually entering the phase where the application is put before government. So we're not quite there yet. There have been a couple of other groups that have formed in response to this mine proposal. The Kamloops Physicians for a Healthy Environment, CAPHE, was formed in 2012. And CAPHE, along with CAPA and Thompson Rivers University Human Rights Committee, have been instrumental in bringing a number of guest speakers to town over the last 3 years. Dr. Drew Stein from UBC spoke on air quality. He was one of the first speakers. Mel Rothenberger, a former mayor and editor of our local paper, spoke about the social impact of the mine. Dr. Brian Munch and Cherise Udell came from Seattle to speak on the Kennecott mine's impact on Salt Lake City. Dr. Peter Segaris, who's an economics professor at TRU, has spoken about the economic impact, and in fact, according to his presentation, the economic impact on healthcare alone will actually require more expenditure than what the mine's going to be bringing in on an annual basis, which was really a very interesting presentation. Those presentations, by the way, are all available online at stopajaxmine.ca. So for anyone who has an interest in mining or any of those particular topics around mining, just consult that website and you can see their entire presentation. Dr. Robert Schemenauer, who's a retired climatologist, spoke on climate change, and Highland Valley Copper Union leader from the nearest open pit gold and copper mine just out of Logan Lake also spoke about jobs and the environmental impact of the mine. And most recently, last Sunday, a Dr. Michael Mehta from Thompson Rivers University spoke on the lack of social impact assessment and how the process, the environmental assessment process that's represented on the slide in front of you now, how that process is totally inadequate and actually it's broken, it's not working. So a second public comment period was recently held in November, December 2014 at the request of CAPA and other interest groups in Kamloops. And another 300 to 350 comments were submitted at that time, most of them posing many, many questions around either the health impact or the economic impact to do with the mine. So briefly, what this mine means is the original plan was to blast 257,260 tons of ore and waste rock per day. And the goal is to produce 60,000 tons of ore that will be loaded onto trucks, driven up the Coquihalla, loaded onto ships, and taken to China for smelting. Now, what I can tell you is that in their original plan, water and hydro use was proposed to match the daily intake of the entire city. And one of the points of contention was that they won't be paying for the water. That, as far as we know, they're not being assessed for the water use. And hydro, from what we were able to tell in their initial application, they were going to be paying 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour for the same hydro that we will be paying anywhere from 7 to 11 cents a kilowatt hour for. Now, we understand that these large projects get subsidized by government, but but we have, of course, some huge concerns around that. And there's been no mention of a carbon tax. I raised that question at one of the presentations, and the response I got from one of the mining people when I asked, what will the carbon tax be for Ajax Mine? His response was, we don't know, government hasn't told us yet. And that was about a year and a half ago. Now, one of our other main concerns has been the mine's refusal to release core sample results. We know from other huge mining projects in other parts of the world that there are toxic elements released into the air. And those consist of arsenic, cadmium, cobalt, lead, manganese, mercury, nickel, selenium, zinc, and chromium. And so far, we haven't been able to get any information on how much of those toxic elements are present in core samples. But we know that they've been drilling in the area for the last 5 years. We also know that in the initial plan, diesel emissions were going to be from 91,000 liters of diesel per day. And that's the equivalent of 7,700 Jettas driving 100 kilometers a day. So somebody's done the math, and we know it's not good for our air quality. We also know that recent air quality data has shown deterioration in our airshed. Currently, we stand below the provincial standards and have for quite some time, since August of last year, and certainly through early winter and spring of this year. Our information tells us that we're actually already below national standards for air quality. Now, while we're still in the pre-application stage, one of my main concerns, and one of the things I've been pretty vocal about with all of our politicians, is that we have not had an independent and proper health impact assessment conducted in Kamloops. We know that these are being done in other jurisdictions. Rather, the Ministry of the Environment and BC has ruled that KGHM International, the Polish company that owns 80% of the mine, has retained their own experts, hired consultants at Stantec, and they're using a tool called the Human Health Environmental something or other assessment. I've looked at their tool. It's not a very detailed tool. It has very poor parameters for measuring air quality and so on. But in addition to that, a couple of years ago, I took a course. Dr. Judith Naylor, a retired pediatrician, and I completed a 12-credit course on how to conduct a proper health impact assessment from the National Collaborating Center for Healthy Public Policy. And in that course, we learned, of course, about how the process is normally carried out and how one would go about ascertaining impact on air and water quality, for example. At that time, I contacted a Swiss researcher by the name of Mirko Winkler. Some of you may have read his work. He was hired to conduct a health impact assessment in Africa, in the Congo, on the Uganda border, by an Australian mining company proposing to build a large open pit gold and copper mine there. Mirko sent me all of his research, and after reading his work, it became abundantly clear to me that we're just simply not in the game at all in Canada. I'm sad to say. In addition to that, I have to back up a little bit here and say that our city council has been somewhat involved. Initially, we had two councillors who were vehemently opposed to the mine and made that well known in the community. In the recent civic election, we've actually got 4 city councillors who are speaking out against the mine. Our city council, our mayor and council have traveled to Ottawa a couple of times and made repeated calls to have a federal panel review, and those requests have been denied pretty much across the board. So the overall impact to date of the proposed mine, there's a promise of some 300 to 500 jobs. We're not quite sure how many, although we do know from the mine's initial plans that they're saying that they will use conveyance systems. So how many of those jobs will stick around for any length of time is unknown. We know that it will have some economic impact on our community. We're not sure exactly how. It's created a tremendous amount of division within our community. So one of the unhealthiest things that's happened to us is it's pitted neighbor against neighbor. So, for example, where I live, I have neighbors on either side of me who the wife is against it, the husband is for, and we simply can't talk about it because it just creates too much angst. There's a lot of fear. Some people are reluctant to speak out because they think that their employers don't want them speaking up. And so there's a tremendous amount of division in the community around this. Now, originally, even with all the changes, we were led to believe that KGHM International would be submitting its finalized application in the spring of 2015. However, as we speak, this still hasn't happened. That submission is expected any day now, within the next, I would expect the next couple of months. When that happens, I just want to go back to this slide showing the environmental assessment process. When that happens, that first purple block there, the application undergoes review, and the Environmental Assessment Office is given 180 days to respond from that point on. Within that 180-day period, there's a 75-day public comment period. Now, I've been led to believe that that is actually planned for fairly early on in the 180 days. What we're asking for is that be delayed until later on in the process so that people have time to read the application in its entirety. It's expected to be several thousand pages of data, some of it very technical, of course, and we would like opportunity to review that application in some depth with some consultants involved, people who know what the technical data means. So here are, in a nutshell, here are our main concerns about the mine to date. The fact that the process seems to be broken, that there's little opportunity for genuine input, a conflicted community, and actually fairly evident. It's fairly evident to us that the more we look into this, the more we realize that it's too big a mine and it's far too close to our community. And we have some major concerns about this. So I'm going to turn this over to June.
Thank you, Claudette. There are other slides, and some of the links, or one link that Claudette talked about is here on this slide, plus there are some other ones as well. And this gives you an idea, map, etc., where it is in Columbia. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to look at this from a national perspective of why we as nurses should be concerned. And to put this into context, as most of you probably know, mining is one of the oldest and most prolific economic activities that we have in Canada. A lot of communities were built because of a mine, etc. In fact, Vancouver, if you look at it historically, there were settlers here before the big gold rush happened, but that was what really brought people in. And it also made Vancouver quite a kind of a rural kind of town for a while. So as the gold rush, people went from California up the coast and then into other parts of British Columbia. So mining has a long history, and I can see what Claudette was talking about it being divisional amongst neighbors, etc. Because if, say, someone's father was a miner and that's the way that they made money for their family, etc., they're obviously going to be pro. But from our perspective, we need to look at the health concerns. And there are many. This map just shows you a little bit of detail about some of the main mines that we have in Canada. And as you'll notice, a lot of them are scattered throughout places where people live. So the kind of scenario that Claudette just described is happening in many communities, some very long term, and it's had some really serious effects on the quality of life and health within those communities. So this is a health and environmental issue. We believe nurses should be involved, and I know I'm talking to Claudette the other day, there's many physicians that are involved with this Kamloops scenario, but not that many nurses, and we think that we should be involved, and we're certainly the group to push that forward. This just gives you a little bit of statistics of where most of the mining's happening, which provinces. The Ontario has the highest amount, and Shelly's going to address that in a few minutes, and then followed by Saskatchewan and British Columbia, which are pretty much the same, and Quebec, then Newfoundland and Labrador. So on the right, there's a very, very brief little list of some of the things that we should be concerned about. Number one, obviously destruction of ecosystems, land destruction, wildlife effects, which often doesn't even get factored in to these assessments, air and rain pollution levels, groundwater contamination, and if tailing ponds are involved, those could leak, etc., affecting lakes, rivers, and the whole surrounding ecological system. This gives just a little overview of rainfall drainage. Now, I know the slide looks a little small within this interface. We will make this PowerPoint available on the website as well so that you can look at it more blown up, full screen. But just number one influence on rain is it makes it acidic. And that has just horrible effects on the environment. As this describes, it's the number one environmental problem that comes from mining industries, and especially in areas where you get a lot of rain, etc. Now, Kamloops not so much because it's a little bit drier, but still, that's good. That whole cycle is going to affect everything. So if you've got the sulfide-bearing minerals being exposed to air and water, which they're not meant to be, it changes to sulfuric acid. Whoop. What happened there? Here, I'll go back to my slide. Changing to sulfuric acid, which affects everything, aquatic habitat, the rain cycle, obviously human beings as well as animals. And one example that I thought was very interesting is that Roman mine sites that occurred in Great Britain when the Romans took over Great Britain for about 500 years or so, continue to generate acid drainage, and that's 2,000 years later. So it's something that we need to think about and something that we should be discussing, etc. And health impact is a major part of this whole process, or it should be looked at. As well, you have the waste. And this waste often is stored. Is someone touching the PowerPoint? Someone keeps putting the PowerPoint back.
You know what, June? I was responsible for the first flip, but obviously somebody just accidentally put it back. Put it back. It wasn't me this time.
Okay, no problem. You, Shelly?
No, it's not me at all.
Okay. Okay. Well, I don't know why it's doing that, but anyway, the waste has to go. Oh dear. Anyway, the waste has to go somewhere, and it often is put into tailing ponds, which
What do you think's happening with the slides, June?
I don't know. I'm just gonna keep going though, because we're recording here. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, it goes into the water, etc., and can be a serious safety hazard, especially if the containment, whatever it's contained within, spills over, etc. It also can allow acidic and metals to go into drainage, which gets dispersed throughout the ecosystems. Dust can be spread by wind, etc. So it can really make a mess, very dangerous to all parts of the environment, including human beings. And you can see in the chart, it shows how many million tons per year are spewed into the environment when a mine is in place. The example I wanted to focus on, which is probably all very much in most people's consciousness, is the Mount Polly disaster. Now, this has been called one of the biggest environmental disasters in Canada. It's okay. I'll just keep going back. I don't know why that's doing that. I don't know if somebody's touching their screen or something.
Nope.
Okay. Anyway, it's been called one of the biggest environmental disasters in modern Canadian history, which the BC government, oh, wow, the BC government denies. So maybe they don't want us to show these slides.
No.
Anyway, so this particular spill happened in the Caribou region of central British Columbia in August 2014 by the Imperial Metals Company. It's a big copper and gold mine. The tailings pond burst, releasing all of its accumulated waste into all of these lakes that are highlighted in red. So Polly Lake, Hazeltine Creek, Quinnell Lake, Caribou Creek, etc., affecting all of the people around the area. And it's still, there's still leftover metals, etc., and it's being poo-pooed. Basically, I don't know if you heard the quip of one of the executives saying that he would drink that water. There's a little tiny picture down here of the green part here is not normal, and there's a lot of pictures online of Mount Polly, the disaster. Also, this was just I thought this was a nice little representation of a webinar that was hosted by the First Nations in the territory to have people become more aware of Mount Polly. So I think my final point is to stress what Claudette really pointed out before. Air quality is seriously compromised. And as we know, when things get into the air, it goes everywhere. It doesn't just stay in the air. It touches everything.
Oh.
I don't know what's going on here. But I'm going to go back to part 3, and hopefully it'll just stay put. And I will hand over the stage to Shelly.
Hello. I guess we'll just try and see if the slides advance or not for now. So what I wanted to speak to you today about was the environmental health impacts of mining in First Nations communities here in Northwestern Ontario. And I wanted to start off by speaking about the boreal forest, which is an unbroken span stretching from the Yukon to the Atlantic. And it occupies about 25% of the land area of North America. It's considered a globally important ecosystem that contains vast expanses of lands that are rich in wildlife. 30% of it is covered by wetlands, 1.5 million lakes, and some of the country's largest river systems. These wetlands act like a giant sponge, absorbing and filtering water and releasing it slowly into the surrounding landscape, which results in protection from flooding, cleaner water, and higher water tables. The boreal forest holds one of the largest reservoirs of fresh water in the world, and it plays a critical role in mitigating global climate change by storing massive amounts of carbon in its soils and wetlands. It also contains hundreds of species of plants and is also home to a wide variety of wildlife, ranging from black bears to billions of migratory bird species, many small mammals, and an abundance of game fish. The forest is the single most important breeding ground for birds in Canada, and it also provides habitat for more than 20 species at risk, like the golden eagle, woodland caribou, polar bears, wolverines, and lake sturgeon. Now, when we talk about the First Nations people, you have to understand they've inhabited this region for thousands of years, and their original homeland was immense, stretching from the northern reaches of the plains to the southeastern shores of the Great Lakes. They regard the land as a gift from the Creator to their people. And the fundamental essence of life is unity and the oneness of all things. So you see that principles of relationship, interdependence, and respect form an ecological compact between humans and all other beings in creation. Ancestral lands are therefore considered sacred to First Nations people. In addition, the gathering, harvesting, and hunting of traditional foods is still practiced in many communities today. The industrial presence on these traditional lands has been described as the toxic invasion of North America. After surviving centuries of racism and discrimination and colonialism, prohibitions against practicing their cultural and spiritual beliefs, First Nations now have to contend with what has been termed environmental racism, such that it's led to a variety of negative ecological impacts on their homelands. In northwestern Ontario, this traditional territory is governed by the CANE-ACIIE Nation, and it covers about 2/3 of the province and is home to 49 communities scattered across the area. The majority of the First Nations here are isolated, with a total on-reserve population of almost 40,000 people. Unemployment rate is high in most communities, so as a result, social transfer payments account for the bulk of family income. And apart from the isolation and lack of employment opportunities, other difficulties include poor housing, poor community services and infrastructure, inadequate medical and dental services, and a lower standard of education. Recently, First Nations have been faced with potential economic development in these traditional territories due to the arrival of various sectors of the resource industry, such as forestry, mining, and energy. And it's always been the desire of the CANE-ACIIE Nation to break free of what's known as their cycle of dependency and become viable, self-sufficient communities. NAN are attempting to set up a land resource decision-making process so that the minerals found on sacred lands will be managed in an integrated basis, taking First Nation treaty rights and environmental responsibilities into account. So if we go back and look at the history of mining in Ontario, we see that in the 1800s, miners could use picks and shovels to find and extract minerals. Embarking out into the wilderness of Ontario, prospectors had free entry to access land that contained Crown-owned minerals. They could stake their claims with wooden posts and acquire mineral leases with no need to consider the interests of property owners or the public. And this was a fundamental feature of Ontario's first mining laws, and it was designed to promote mining activity, create wealth, and encourage the settlement of the north. Today, we know that Ontario is Canada's leading mining jurisdiction. It's the source of 30% of the total value of the nation's metal production. Currently, over 5.4 million hectares of the province's lands are under active mining claims, representing an area larger than PEI. And the total value of mineral production has been estimated at over $9.8 billion. A significant mineral discovery was made in the Ring of Fire, which is located about 500 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay. It's an area of roughly 5,100 square kilometers that's located in the boreal forest that is subject to intense claim staking, prospecting, and exploration ever since nickel, copper, and zinc were discovered in the area in the late 1990s. The area also consists of one of the world's largest chromite discoveries. Now, chromite is a mineral that is made up of iron oxide and chromium, and demand for it is high worldwide, particularly in countries like China, which is the largest consumer of ferrochrome, which is an alloy made from chromite used to produce stainless steel. It's also a strategic mineral used in the production of missile components and armor plating. Now, the human carcinogenicity of chromium is pretty well established. Mining and smelting waste can still contain chromium and other heavy metals and chemicals of concern. Exposure can occur through skin absorption, inhalation, drinking or consumption of contaminated soil, water, food, or dust. Skin contact can cause inflammation, eczema, open sores, and allergic contact dermatitis, while ingestion can cause nausea, vomiting, anemia, kidney, stomach, liver, and intestine damage. Inhalation irritates not just the nose, throat, and lungs, but it produces inflammation, can cause nosebleeds, ulcers, and holes in the septum, as well as asthma, lung cancer, and a variety of other cancers. Now, the deposits in the Ring of Fire have attracted international attention from the mining industry. Companies have now staked 9,000 claims in the region, and due to the location of the finds, it's remote First Nations communities who will experience most of the social, health, and environmental impacts from these projects. And although the Mining Act and the concept of free entry may have worked in the 19th century, it's at odds with current land use management strategies. So in October 2009, Bill 173 received royal assent in Ontario, concluding a multi-year process to bring the Mining Act into the 21st century. And among the amendments included things like encouraging mining activities in a manner that was consistent with the recognition and affirmation of existing First Nations treaty rights, incorporating consultation into mining legislation, and introducing a dispute resolution process for First Nations related mining issues. Now, how does that updated act, does it serve to deal with some of the controversy over northern mining? Well, we know that First Nations treaty rights are collective rights that are affirmed within the Canadian Constitution. When this issue has been challenged, the courts have consistently ruled in favor of the continuing efficacy of these rights. But if minerals of economic value are found on any traditional territory, they could be developed into mines whether the land is privately owned, subject to First Nation land claims, or already used for other purposes that are incompatible with mining. The reason for this is that the free entry system allows people to come in, pay $25, obtain a prospector's license, and stake as many claims as they like, as long as they pay a nominal claims registration fee and perform at least $400 annually of assessment work. So First Nations communities have had to issue moratoriums or stage blockades to protest unwanted mining activity on their lands. The problem is that the treaties that have been interpreted by governments as land surrender agreements, rather than the land sharing agreements First Nations communities thought they had signed. So this issue of treaty rights is set against a possible economic boom, which makes this a rather complex situation for everyone. Figures show that mining is the largest private sector employer of First Nations in Canada, accounting for about 7% of the total mining labor force. Northern Ontario's mine supply and service sector is worth an estimated $5 billion a year and provides an additional 23,000 jobs to the area. So while the short-term interests of a mine sound great, they need to be measured against the long-term impacts on health, water and air quality, fish and wildlife habitat, and community interests. But this doesn't always happen. Even when mineral development results in economic growth, the benefits are not always shared equitably, and local communities closest to the source of development can suffer the most after a mine closes and stops producing revenue. So it's not surprising that the resolution of divergent rights, the right to explore and develop a mine versus the community's right to manage its traditional territory, remains an issue in several regions across Canada. Some First Nations communities who have found mining companies unresponsive to their concerns have been forced to assert their rights in court. Legal action is preferably the last resort, as it tends to be expensive and resource consuming, and can be divisive within and between communities. We know that Ontario has also already faced opposition from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation in Ipperwash, the Six Nations communities in Caledonia, and the Erdoc Algonquin First Nation in Frontenac. But I wanted to speak to one experience specific to my region, which is the Big Trout Lake experience. Platnix Incorporated, it's a Toronto-based junior exploration company, acquired mineral claims within the traditional territory of Big Trout Lake First Nation in 1999. Now, Big Trout is a flying community of about 900 people who live in the remote northwestern part of the province. It's about 600 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. For a time, Platnix was in discussion with the community about its plans, but then they proceeded with its activities before reaching an agreement. So in 2001, Big Trout issued a moratorium on further activity until a satisfactory agreement was reached. In 2006, the conflict escalated, and members of the community actively protested and blocked Platinum from their territory. More conflict and court proceedings ensued, and in 2007, frustrated by the cost and the time being taken up in court, Big Trout withdrew its participation in legal proceedings, and a court issued an injunction prohibiting them from interfering in Platinum's activities. So the community issued a statement saying they would not allow Platinums back on their land, and this led to contempt charges and eventual jail time for the chief and 5 band councillors. An appeal of the sentences was heard, and all 6 of those in jail were released. The appeal decision cited problems with the Mining Act and the weak role of the province in constructing any kind of constructive consultation. So the jailing of 6 First Nation leaders for peacefully asserting their constitutional rights to consultation and accommodation catapulted mining reform onto the front pages of newspapers and onto the priority list for the provincial government. In addition, high-profile Canadians rallied, and 1,000 people convened on Queen's Park. The province was then forced to lay out a framework for consultation in the new Mining Act, and in 2009, Platinum withdrew from Big Trout. They received $5 million plus mediation for ceding their claim to the community. And in March 2012, the government withdrew 23,000 square kilometers for mineral exploration and development around this area. So, while we see that the passage of the new bill led Ontario to become the first jurisdiction in Canada to expressly recognize First Nation treaty rights, there's nothing in the amended act that actually requires consultation with First Nation community prior to staking claims on treaty lands. Furthermore, the bill does not require proponents to develop revenue sharing between mining companies and affected First Nations. And despite the provision requiring consistency with land use plans, the government may prevent a new mine opening in the far north if a project is in the social and economic interests of Ontario. Now we know that a single mine is the center of a web of development that includes the construction of roads, power generating facilities and transmission lines, as well as impoundment areas and dams. Mining can also permanently change the character of the landscape in a number of ways, from stripping and flooding productive lands to limiting opportunities to pursue other land-based activities. Water is essential to many phases of the mining sequence. The mineral sector is the 4th largest industrial water user in Canada, using about 1.7 billion cubic meters of fresh water per year. Of this, 78% is discharged directly into lakes and rivers without being treated. High-pressure water is also used to strip soil and vegetation, to keep dust down during construction, to separate ore during milling, and to flood tailings and waste rock areas. However, the activity that places the largest demand on fresh water supplies is dewatering of mine pits and shafts. Dewatering is required to keep the mine dry in order to reach the ore in question. Now, some of the processes for dewatering mine flood areas that naturally contain mercury and convert it to a highly toxic form called methylmercury. This is a neurotoxin. It can cross the blood-brain barrier and the placental barrier, and allows it to react directly with brain and fetal cells. Mercury contamination causes a wide range of symptoms, and particularly affecting the kidneys and neurological system. While low levels may not be directly lethal for individual organisms, toxicological effects like impaired reproduction, growth, neurodevelopment, and learning ability, in addition to behavioral changes, can lead to increases in mortality and the risk of predation for some wildlife. The most important pathway for mercury bioaccumulation is through the food chain, as predators eat each other and absorb the contaminants that their food sources contained. Over time, an individual who consumes plants or prey contaminated with methylmercury will acquire levels greater than either its habitat or in its food. As a result, top predators acquire greater body burdens of mercury than the food they consume. Now, some of the worst environmental offenders from the mining industry in Canada have left water bodies so polluted that they're unfit for human use and cannot sustain healthy ecosystems. Downstream monitoring required by regulations show that mines, even those that are meeting water quality standards, are still having impacts on aquatic ecosystems. Determining which chemicals in the mine effluent are the causes of the problem can be a real challenge. Ontario has established water quality standards enforced through its Resources Act, which is supposed to protect water resources from pollution levels above established thresholds. Unfortunately, the province has allowed the mining industry to continue its long-standing practice of dealing with waste by releasing effluent into otherwise healthy water bodies, and relying on rivers and streams to dilute pollution levels. These areas where pollution levels are allowed to exceed provincial water quality standards are called mixing zones. Where they have not been approved or discharge levels have been exceeded, charges can be laid, but this generally does not happen. In fact, there have been more than 50 breaches of established water pollution thresholds by the mineral sector in Northern Ontario, but no convictions. And most mining activities like soil stripping, trenching, road building, ore extraction, and others can lead to the release of soil and sediment into nearby streams and lakes. Water quality and aquatic habitats can be affected by increased amounts of sediment in the water column and settling on stream beds. When it is suspended in the water column, sediment can cause tissue rot or even directly kill fish. When it settles, it can smother fish eggs and aquatic plants, resulting in a decrease of both reproductive and survival rates for affected species. And in addition, increased turbidity can decrease water temperatures and make it hard for fish to locate food. The actual footprint of many mine sites will continue to endure even after reclamation efforts have been undertaken. An open pit mine may be as large as 5,000 hectares, but the actual footprint of a mine, including areas impacted by exploration and dewatering, can be as much as 300,000 hectares, which is equivalent to 600,000 soccer fields. Mining is one of the least efficient extractive industries in Canada. Of all the material removed from the ground by a typical Canadian mine, only 2% of it can be converted into value. A mine might produce hundreds of millions of tons of waste, and much of what remains becomes hazardous in perpetuity due to the risk of acid mine drainage, which June mentioned, and heavy metal pollution, which Claudette mentioned. So the process of producing metal from an ore is called smelting, and we know that smelting represents yet another layer of potential environmental impacts associated with mine production. Smelters and blast furnaces continue to release airborne pollutants from smokestacks. And Claudette mentioned mercury, lead, benzenes, arsenic, chromium, lead, manganese, dioxins, furans, and a number of other highly toxic compounds ended up settling in plumes downwind of the release points, where they mix to become part of the rain, sleet, snow, and fog released on local populations. Once in the soil, some of these toxins are taken up by vegetation and can then move through the food chain, becoming more concentrated through bioaccumulation. Smelting has also been linked with the release of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides into the air, both which are leading causes of acid rain. Coupled with the effects of climate change, both have been shown to work together to make water clearer and more easily penetrated by harmful ultraviolet radiation. Research from the Experimental Lakes area in northwestern Ontario suggests that some aquatic species, such as those whose young develop in shallow waters, are put at risk from exposure to increased UV radiation, which has also been shown to damage aquatic food webs, decrease photosynthesis and growth in some aquatic algae, and harm some aquatic invertebrates. Another concern is the impact of fuel spills at exploration sites. It's unclear how often these occur, since they usually happen in remote areas that have little to no regulatory oversight. And although companies are required to document and clean up fuel spills, anecdotal accounts of fuel drones being lost in bogs at an exploration site near Trout Lake indicate that large spills may not always be properly reported. And we know in Ontario's boreal region, access roads and transmission lines that serve remote mines can cut through the forest and interrupt the landscape. Biologists call this the landscape fragmentation because it divides the continuous forest into smaller pieces. Fragmentation reduces the quality of forest habitat for wildlife, provides travel corridors for predators like wolves. This interferes with normal predator-prey relationships. It also increases access for human predators, which can lead to increases in hunting and fishing. So you see that it's one of the primary reasons for the loss of Ontario's woodland caribou populations, which is a species that tells us about the overall health of the boreal forest. There are also clear relationships between building accessible roads and the decline of other species, such as lake trout, as the level of fishing in a particular lake is directly linked to how accessible it is by road. Just a single road creates many new access points in the forest, which in turn attracts more use and further fragments an area. So while a mine may be in production for only 15 years, the irreversible and long-term impacts of fragmenting land are rarely considered. So let's turn to an example of a First Nations experience with uranium mining in the Serpent River. Uranium mining began in 1955 in Elliott Lake, which is upstream from the Serpent River First Nation, and continued until the early 1990s. Serpent River is a small community located on the north shore of Lake Huron, and little thought was given to protecting the ecosystem or the downstream community. We know that uranium is a heavy metal with the potential to cause a spectrum of adverse health effects ranging from renal failure and diminished bone growth to damage to the DNA. Increased glucose levels in the urine and high blood pressure have also been reported. And because uranium possesses both chemical toxicity and radioactivity, assessing the relative contributions of each to its toxic profile is difficult. The effects of low-level radioactivity include cancer, shortening of life, and subtle changes in fertility or viability of offspring. These effects can be delayed for decades and are not detected in short-term toxicologic studies. So the people of Serpent River First Nation are still experiencing severe environmental health, social, cultural, and economic impacts from uranium mining, milling, and tailing disposal. Alkali and acid washes, which isolate uranium, are highly toxic, as is the remaining 80 to 99% of the ore. This is stored in ponds or containment fields to prevent wind and water erosion, but insufficient covering means that radioactive particles and radon can be swept many kilometers away from its housing. And besides the chemicals used in washes, toxic tailings contain sulfide ores, selenium, arsenic, and mercury, and approximately 85% of the radioactivity of the original ore. So we know that contamination from uranium mining activity will persist for generations. The dust that blows away from the sites and the copious amounts of water used for dust control and uranium extraction all contain long-lived radioisotopes that are disseminated into the environment. In the tailings, thorium-230 decays to produce radon gas, and with a half-life of 76,000 years, it will produce radon for millennia. In the atmosphere, radon decays into the radioactive solids polonium, bismuth, and lead, which then enter the water, crops, trees, soil, affecting both animals and humans. Radon exposure is also linked to increases in lung cancer, small cell carcinoma, Aden sarcoma, and squamous cell carcinoma. So it's no wonder then that cancer and other disease rates have skyrocketed and taken a dreadful toll on the local population. The Serpent River watershed still holds 165 million tons of radioactive tailings left on the surface, which will require monitoring and treatment of the runoff in perpetuity. Yet neither the federal nor the provincial governments can confirm the location and quantities of these uranium tailings. This has raised enormous concerns with First Nations leadership because these radioactive tailings are still affecting the traditional livelihoods of the community members and the ecosystems that rely on the waterways to survive. Not to mention the fact that the water and sediment of the Serpent River are still contaminated, and the danger of a major spill is never too far away. So it should come as no surprise that other Canadian jurisdictions have applied restrictions, guidelines, or a moratorium on uranium exploration. Several Ontario municipalities and organizations like the David Suzuki Foundation and Amnesty International have requested that the Government of Ontario suspend uranium prospecting, exploration, and mining until the associated health, environmental, and economic issues are resolved. So let's turn to another community, which is Attawapiskat, and their experience with the Victor Diamond Mine. Attawapiskat is a remote Cree community of less than 2,000 people who live along the coast of James Bay. They currently are the home to De Beers Victor Diamond Mine. Victor is the first diamond mine for the province of Ontario, and De Beers' second Canadian mine. The open pit is 230 meters deep and up to 950 meters wide, and the ecological footprint of the mine is much larger, up to 260,000 hectares, which is an area roughly 4 times the size of Toronto, is impacted. A new hydro corridor and access road from the coastal community of Attawapiskat to the mine site bisects intact wilderness, and an existing winter road along the James Bay coast has been upgraded for heavy use by large haul trucks, further spreading the footprint of the mine. Yet the total life of the project is estimated at just 17 years. There have been some protests and blockades by the community, in 2009 and 2013, which prevented De Beers from continuing its mining operations. But the committee felt essentially that they were being treated unfairly and receiving inadequate compensation for the use of its territory. Each time the blockades came down after court injunctions, the last one, issued in 2013, prevents any protests for 3 years, during which time anyone violating the restriction will be imprisoned. But we know that as of January 2015, De Beers actually has plans to expand its Victor Diamond mine, regardless of the protests. So, in terms of mining, we also need to look at the occupational health and safety issues that affect the mining labor force in Ontario. The most immediate health hazards associated with mining include airborne pollutants and physical hazards. The specific issues depend on the mine or quarry, its depth, the composition of the ore and rock, and the methods employed. Silica dust is a common contaminant that miners and quarry workers encounter. Exposure can increase the risk of TB, lung cancer, and various autoimmune diseases. Physical hazards include vibration, noise, ionizing radiation, and heat. In addition, mine fires and explosions are constant risks in the industry and require stringent preventative efforts. Health and safety concerns for workers in the smelting and refining industry include injuries, heat-related illnesses, chemical and other physical hazards such as electrocution. The Government of Ontario in 2014 launched a comprehensive mining safety review to further improve the health and well-being of workers in the industry. An advisory group consisting of industry, labor, and health and safety representatives began a collaborative, evidence-based review on a wide range of areas. We have yet to see the final report, but still at issue are the health effects being felt by miners prior to any new legislation being implemented. Serpent River miners, for example, were never told about the potential of radioactive exposure and its health effects. So certainly some of the issue of compensation will be a complicated one in the future. And in terms of what people can do, based on all of what we've discussed about mining today, certainly we can look at things like citizen advocacy and coalition building. Citizen advocacy is one way for those concerned about mining and its effects to become informed. And one great way to access information is Environment Canada's self-reporting inventory of pollutants that are released into the air, water, and land from industries from across Canada. The National Pollutant Release Inventory provides information on over 400 pollutant materials, including potential health effects from exposure and the best available information on safe exposure thresholds. Data of this kind and amount of toxic substances released from smelters and ore concentrating facilities can be found on the NPRI website. A recent legal challenge also forced the federal government to collect and report data on the toxic pollutants in waste rock and tailing areas. And to get involved, there are many avenues open to you. You can join letter writing campaigns or lend your voice to petitions. You can raise your voice in government consultations or reviews open to public input. You can get together with friends or colleagues to form your own group advocating for a particular cause. You can create videos on YouTube to share your ideas, Twitter your support, seek to attend events that you care about, go to meetings, speak at hearings, or attend rallies. Your participation is invaluable in shaping public discourse on environmental health issues. And of course, we welcome you in any of the activities that interest you as a member of SNE. So that's the conclusion to my presentation. I apologize that the slides weren't really cooperating, but I think I'll turn it over to June to basically welcome us into the discussion section.
Thank you very much, Claudette and Shelly. That was wonderful. And again, we do apologize. I don't know, this PowerPoint's got a mind of its own. It just, I don't know what's going on there. But I'd like to open it up now for discussion. So if anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, remember that you need to unmute yourself.
It's Claudette here, June. I just wanted to follow up on one of the comments you made about Canada's place in mining on the world level, if I may.
Yes, please do.
I received a document just last week that addressed copper mining specifically, showing that Canada places 10th in the world overall in exporting copper. We're way behind countries like Chile and Australia. Interestingly enough, I thought we were exporting more copper than that, but apparently not. So just out of interest.
That's very interesting. Yes, and yet it's promoted as such a crucial industry
Mm-hmm.
from powers on high.
What's
Anyone
also
else like to comment?
What's also interesting, June, I don't know if you heard in the latest federal budget that came down that the government is putting millions of dollars into chromite mining, particularly in northwestern Ontario. So that's another huge issue that needs to be resolved.
One of the
Very.
things that people may not be aware of is that I've learned through this process that Canada's mining laws are 150 years old, and that's one of the problems. I don't know if it's now. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know that that's true in British Columbia. Our mining laws in BC are definitely 150 years old. And whenever that's been raised, we've tried to raise that with government in British Columbia. We've questioned why it is that liquor laws can be changed in a heartbeat, but mining laws, they claim, cannot be changed at all.
Wow.
Hmm.
Isn't true.
Interesting, yeah. Now, one of the other things that hasn't been mentioned at all today is the effect of mine dust on pollinators. I've come across some very interesting research, most of it out of Europe, none from Canada, incidentally, but and a lot of it was done in Poland in the last 10 years. But evidently, they've been able to show that in fairly large areas surrounding mines where dust levels rise significantly, pollinators are no longer able to pollinate plants.
Well, that's stunning to hear, considering all the environmental impacts that neonics and stuff are having on honeybees. That's kind of a
Mm-hmm.
tragic thing to hear.
Mm-hmm. So one of the people that works on our group has done that body of research, and she has amazing studies that show, and yet pollinators weren't even mentioned in the Ajax mine application. There was no mention of pollinators at all.
I think that's something we should emphasize as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's certainly something we need to be aware of, June.
Yes, definitely.
And when Shelly, when you were talking about all of the damages that have been done from mining over the years in Ontario and the legal wrangling, as an aftermath to that, I couldn't help but think about the giant mine in Yellowknife and the repercussions from that mine with arsenic poisoning
Mm-hmm.
and the recent 16x9 program that was done on how that unfolded over a 30-year period. You know, the fact that the locals were constantly writing letters to Ottawa saying there's something wrong. Our children are sick, and children were actually dying. First Nations children primarily were dying from eating the snow up there, and they were found to have very high arsenic levels in their bodies on autopsy. And when that was raised with the federal government, they were told there's no problem, everything's fine. There's absolutely no problems with the arsenic up there. Well, now we know different, of course, and the cost of that cleanup has been estimated at $1 billion. The mine walked away a number of years ago, declared bankruptcy and walked away. and the Canadian government, you and I are picking up the tab for that cleanup. And the 16x9 report, did any of you see that report?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, no.
No one's seen it?
Not the actual report, no.
Okay, I highly recommend that you look it up. You can probably still access it on the internet. It was done probably 2.5 months ago, but it was a real eye opener on gold and copper mining, exactly what they're proposing to do here, and what they've done in Yellowknife, because they had nowhere to put the arsenic. They pumped it underground, and they were worried about the arsenic leaching into waterways. So they've actually built huge refrigeration units around these, what they describe as, they would be the equivalent of a high-rise building, underground, completely full of arsenic. And they've built these refrigeration units on the outside to keep that permanently frozen so that the arsenic does not enter groundwater.
Comfortable to hear that. I think people are having problems with their microphones. There's a couple of messages, but I'm wondering if you can't speak, can you see the chat window to the right? At the very bottom, there's a form field you can type in there. Have any questions that you want us to address or comments to make?
I see from Donna, she has to get off soon, but she said she wants us to definitely bring some of this information forward, but she's wondering how we go about doing that.
Well, we're going to put, like we did with the tar sands, put the expose and the PowerPoint on our website. And then we can discuss that, at a board meeting. We usually put places where people can get involved, like links to petitions that exist, etc. But I think it's basically we're supporting the groups that are already organized, such as the physicians, etc.
Donna just followed up and said, is there a form for these presentations to public health nurse practitioners?
Sorry? Well, they're involved. People can join our group. These are, that's what we're trying to encourage. Any nurse in Canada or beyond can join our group. That's one thing that's nice about our so-called specialty. We're in the specialty network, but we are across specialties. Any nurse could join. You don't have to be like an OR nurse, etc.
Well, I think, this is sort of a first step, right, for all of us to.
Yes.
I mean, I've learned so much having to research and talk to different people about mining and health, and it's such a huge issue.
Exactly.
And, who knows where we can go in the future. I know we've talked about maybe making this presentation available for the general public as people have requested. I don't know, do you have any ideas, Claudette?
Shelly, I just want to echo what you just said about the learning. I had absolutely no idea about any of this 4 years ago, and it was only through my involvement in CAPA and the physicians group and reading tons of research from all over the world and posing different questions. I think the average nurse really doesn't have much information on any of this. It's not something that's taught, I don't think, to any extent in nursing programs. And maybe it's something that needs to be incorporated into basic education, because as you've pointed out, June, it does cross all boundaries, all subspecialties within nursing. So And especially in this day and age, it seems to me like it's it's fundamental knowledge. If we don't save the planet, we might as well forget about health, period.
Exactly. Our environment is so important. And
And
again, that's why this whole group was formed, to address
yes,
these various issues.
the other thing that came up just earlier today, incidentally, I was listening to a CBC program on radio at noon today about the political structure in Russia and the history of that. And there was mention of Russia being exceptionally rich in fresh water. There was never any mention of Russia's oil or minerals. It was fresh water that was mentioned. And I'm thinking, so what about us?
We used to be known for that
Mm-hmm.
when I was a child.
There was a time when we could drink the water, wasn't there?
Yes, it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So are we
Oh,
not able to get our people, are Marilyn and Donna not able to, and Fiona not able to post questions? Is that what I'm hearing?
yes, there's some problem unmuting themselves on the phones, I guess.
Oh, sure.
I'm going to mute my microphone here and see if that makes a difference.
I'm going to try unmuting everybody.
And just to follow up
There we
what we're
go.
getting at, I think it was Donna who said we need to get some type of course program on this. How do we do it?
Okay.
Maybe that's a discussion for another time.
Hi, June. Can you hear me now?
Yes, but it's when everybody's unmuted, there's a lot of extra noise, I think.
Okay, so I'll just mute myself. I do have to leave, but that was a question, and maybe we can discuss it another time.
Yes, but we're going to be putting this up on our site, so we will be sharing with the public, not the recording part, but the PowerPoint and the writing that Claudette has given me as well. So, and if you look at the tar sands page at the bottom, we have places where they can go, like addresses for the MPs, petitions that exist, and I'm sure there are petitions on the sites that Claudette shared, etc., to help support the Ajax, the people that are questioning the Ajax mine, etc. And then there's also other initiatives going on across Canada. So we'll make a resource page on our site. That'll be the first step. But we're also going to put this recording up in the education part of our member portal and put up a forum to go with that, etc. So hopefully some discussion with our members will occur. And then we'll go from there.
And June, is it okay if we have if a link is sent to me for Claudette, specifically I'm addressing Claudette at this point. Shelly, your presentation was amazing, but Claudette, because she's here in the province of British Columbia, and makes it possible to link to this group that I'm working on with the engineering community. Would that be would Claudette, would you be comfortable, June, also as well with that idea of linking Claudette to another group that are?
Yeah, is this Donna speaking?
Yes, it's Donna.
Donna, I would love to link with other groups. I think that's where the power lies in coming together.
So, June, I'll connect with you on that one as soon as I get back to the Canadian Water Resources Association, and you sort of have to navigate between the.
Yeah. Yes, I understand.
Okay, I'm going to unmute myself, and thank you. This was wonderful, and all three presentations amazing. I'm just amazed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Donna.
Thank you, Donna.
Fiona, Marilyn, did you want to say anything?
I don't know if my microphone is working correctly.
I can hear you.
I can hear you, Fiona.
I just, I also want to say that there's a lot of information, and It was very, very thorough, and I learned a lot, and I really look forward to taking active taking position on a few of these as other physicians, as other healthcare professionals have done. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to bringing this back to the board. Thank you.
Unmuting myself here. Fiona, did you have anything? Sure, if you're able to get your mic working, it's open on this end. That our mic's not working. Alrighty. Well, I think we're past our time, but I do want to thank everyone for coming in on especially on a Friday afternoon, making this a meaningful presentation, etc. And like I said, we will take those next steps. And I know at some point we may want to propose to CNA, but usually we have to get things moving within our own group, and then we may bring it forward and ask the CNA if they would be willing to do a resolution on it. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. So.
I want to thank you, June, for taking the lead on this, and thank you, Shelly. Your presentation was amazing.
Thank you. So was yours. It was
So was yours, yeah.
For all of us.
Very educational and thought-provoking. Thank you.
I'm deeply encouraged by hearing that nurses are actually getting involved and have a say in these important health issues. So
Thank
thanks
you, everyone.
again.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn the recording off now.
Okay.